Evening, comrades. Welcome to this week's Online Communist Forum. The forum is a joint production, one of a grand title, from the Communist Party of Great Britain and Labour Party Marxists. My name is Andy, and I will be facilitating the discussion tonight. The discussion is over two parts. So we've got Yasmin Mather, who will be given a bit of a discussion around what's happening in Syria. And that will be followed by contributions from the floor and any questions that comrades may have. And then we'll move on to the political discussion, which will be delivered by Jack Conrad from the CP. Before I go any further, if you would like to speak, if you can use the raise hand facility, you should see that under reactions, depending on what device you're using. And I'll bring people in as they indicate. We normally do not live stream the discussion. However, because of the structure of this particular forum, we will be live streaming the discussion which follows from Yasmin's introduction on Syria. So without any further ado, I will hand over to Yasmin.
Thanks very much, Andy. Well, first of all, I have to admit that I'm no expert on Syria, and what I'm saying in these very first hours, basically, of the first 24 hours of the fall of Damascus is based on what I can read in Arabic with my very limited school Arabic, but also in Farsi that might not be available in the British press and media. The fall of Assad was probably obvious by Friday of this week. However, I think even by the standards of the Middle East, things moved very fast in the last hours yesterday. One of the reasons one could have predicted that Assad was going to fall was that the Iranian government moved most of its embassy staff, its consulate staff, out of Damascus Friday. I think the Russians did so earlier. So it was quite clear that Russia and Iran were not going to support Assad in his last hour. We also have today Netanyahu's triumphant speech in the last few hours. This wouldn't have happened if we hadn't weakened Hezbollah and Iran. And that is definitely a fact. I don't think anyone, the rebels wouldn't have considered extending their forces beyond Idlib, which was a region they controlled, unless Iran and Hezbollah had been weakened. And obviously, it is also true that Israel has weakened Hezbollah and Iran. However, all this hasn't stopped Israel bombing very significant number of bombings today in Syria. The latest ones that I have seen, the security complex in Damascus is getting bombed. Apparently, according to IDF, there are dangerous weapons in some of these places that might fall into the hands of jihadis. Well, there is stories and stories. So was Assad less of an enemy than the jihadis if you are just bombing them now? Or is it because you now know Iran and Russia will not retaliate your bombing? I think here we also have to remember that we don't know how much Iran was weakened by the Israeli military attack that happened in October. But we have a speech by the British Armed Forces chief who was speaking last week to Rusi, who claims that Israeli bombing of Iran has turned back the country's ballistic missile capability by at least a year. And that is significant. If that is true, given its weaker position, Iran might have decided that it wasn't worth expanding its military power against the rebels in defending Assad. It was wiser to keep whatever it has for its own defenses. However, I think all this has to be seen in the light of what some of us were seeing in the middle of last week, and that was a changing position in Tehran. I don't follow Russia's politics, so I don't know when Russia changed that policy. My understanding is that Russia decided yesterday in the final discussions between Assad and sections of the opposition that there was no compromise to be had, and therefore advised Assad to leave, basically. But Iran's position changed earlier in the early part of last week. And by midweek, we were seeing some very strange articles in the Iranian press, especially those sections of the Iranian press that are pro-Supreme Leader, sections that are close to some parts of Iran Revolutionary Guard. The newspaper Ham-Mihan reported the advances by the rebels in a very positive light, very unusual for Iran. Iran has constantly referred to these rebels as jihadist, Salafist, enemies of the Syrian people. So that was a change in tone. This change in tone was picked up by the rest of Iranian press and media, but this can't be an accidental change in their views. Because obviously they wouldn't have dared publish articles against Assad if the official line hadn't changed. And definitely the official line had changed. The editorials in papers close to the Supreme Leader had changed. And we also had pictures of the rebels with a slogan, "On the road to Damascus." Very strange. There was speculation. Some people called it Iran's enigma regarding Sham. Sham is the Arabic word for Syria. So the enigma was what is happening. As I said, we now know the embassy was emptied on Friday. I think we hear there is speculation, obviously, about the military capability of Iran, whether it didn't want to use it for Assad. But there is also speculation on political reasons why Iran isolated Assad in his last hours, in the hours where he needed support. And a number of those issues have been widely discussed on Arabic and Persian websites today. Apparently, there were 22 meetings, believe it or not, between the signing of a peace deal regarding Idlib between Russia, Turkey, and the rebels on the one hand, Russia representing Assad. And in these 22 meetings, attempts were made to find some kind of compromise, some kind of, if you like, what people call long-term solutions. And in most of these, some reports suggest, and here I can only rely on what is being reported. I have no internal knowledge. I didn't even know 22 meetings had taken place. But many comment on the intransigence of Assad regarding Idlib, which apparently annoyed some of his allies, including Russia at least, but maybe also Iran. But there is also comments about Assad's refusal to side fully with the axis of resistance. And here, what is referred to is Iran's request to use the Golan Heights at the time when Hezbollah was being attacked in order to help Hezbollah, and Assad refused that. Again, this could be, and in the Middle East, you always have to think that this could be false information put out by the Islamic Republic because in the last minute it decided not to support Assad, and now it's looking for excuses on why it didn't support Assad. But it was seen as Assad as a continuation of Assad's refusal to, if you like, be an active and real part of the axis of resistance. When people talk of the axis of resistance, I must admit, they very rarely mention Syria. What is mentioned is mainly Houthis, Hezbollah, and Iran, and Syria at the end, but no one has really seen major operations by Syria, except that Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders have been targeted in Syria, and in that way, I think Israel has dealt a severe blow to Iran rather than to Syria. News got even worse when Araghchi, who a week earlier had said he would support Iran, would do whatever is necessary to support Assad, was interviewed and refused to comment that he could predict survival of Assad. This was Thursday of the week that passed, in complete contrast to what he said a week before on Friday. So that is part of the scenario. It doesn't explain many of the reasons why Iran and Russia didn't support Assad. Last week, I was interviewed by a news agency about Russia versus Iran in support for Syria, and the reporter was asking me, well, isn't it true that Russia has been much more active supporting Syria than it has been supporting Iran? I think that is true to a certain extent. For Russia, the jihadists are not just an existentialist force in the Middle East. Quite a lot of these jihadists are Chechens or Turkish-speaking jihadists from the republics in the southern borders of Russia. And given Putin's obsession about Chechnya, it's inevitable that that also played a part. A few comments about HDSA, this group that was a jihadi group, was part of Al-Qaeda. I think you don't need a lot of historical explanations. All you have to do is look at Jawlani's pictures. He's photographed in 2014, looking very much like bin Laden, wearing clothes of bin Laden. In the last week, we have seen him being interviewed by women reporters. He wouldn't have seen a woman, wouldn't have been in the same room as a woman who was just veiled by a small headscarf. But also, he now looks like Zelensky. In fact, many people have commented on how his appearance does remind us of Zelensky. Contradictory messages to the countries of the region. To Iran, late last week, he said, Jawlani, addressing Iran, said, you should reconsider your support for Assad. We have nothing against you. We can be as friendly to you as Assad is or was. However, another commander from the same group told Israeli TV and an Israeli official reporter, we are your friends. Our only enemies are Iran, Hezbollah, and it was Assad, and now he's gone. So you shouldn't believe, I think, anything that Jawlani says or anything that his political group says. But the turmoil has just begun. I can't imagine that this group will remain in power. There are many contenders for power in Syria. There would be many infighting between those contenders. Yes, very few of them had the power of this group. They didn't have a region like Idlib under their control. But whether Jawlani can control some of the excesses of his own armed forces is under question. He keeps telling them, be nice to children. In Aleppo, I am told that once the troops entered Aleppo, Halab in Arabic, they offered food to the residents. They were friendly to the Christians and so on. But remember, this is the organization that also beheaded opponents. It's also a very brutal, crude jihadi force. Whether the new Zelensky-looking Jawlani can control his jihadi forces is very much in doubt. But most importantly, you can't possibly imagine that the maybe secular forces who opposed Assad in 2011, but also the myriad of other opposition groups that did oppose Assad and have been quiet over the last few years because of repression by the Ba'ath regime, will be quiet and will say nothing from now on. There is speculation about Israeli advances in the Golan Heights. We should expect that. There is also speculation that Israel might advance quite further into Syria under the excuse of protection, self-defense, whatever they have used on other subjects. One of the saddest part of the whole scene is now the Syrian-Lebanese border. In the last 2 weeks, it was the scene of Lebanese from South Lebanon returning from Syria to go back to Lebanon and go back to the demolished area that Israel has left after carpet bombing of South Lebanon. We now have Syrians who are returning to Syria from Lebanon, who were refugees. Lebanon had a very large number of, I think, a couple of million Syrians who were refugees. One of the largest population of refugees in Lebanon was Syrians. They are returning, but there are also the Syrians who are leaving Syria, and the border, the chaos on the border is, in my view, a glance at the chaotic and unbelievably harsh situation that the peoples of the region are facing in what, at the end of the day, remains the responsibility of the kind of scorched earth area that the United States and its ally Israel have created in the region. That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Yasmin. Before I open it up to contributions from the floor, just a reminder that we are continuing to live stream this part of the forum this evening. Okay, do I have anyone who wishes to come in? Perhaps I can start some of the discussion off, actually, Yasmin, if you don't mind. You mentioned about Iran asking for access to, or to use the Golan Heights. Now, presumably this is the Golan Heights, which is currently occupied by Israel.
Sorry, the Golan Heights has, I think, covers a large area. So they were asking Syria for the part close to the Golan Heights where Syria was and remains in control. At the moment, Syria remains in control of what I'm talking about is Syrian territory, not Israeli territory.
Okay, occupied, yeah. Okay, thank you very much for the clarification. I have Tina.
Yeah, thanks for that interesting introduction. I was in a meeting earlier today with Craig Murray and a few others who very much explained it. This is a regime change operation led by the US, more or less, in Syria, and that basically we have to, as socialists, as lefties, we have to support Assad, who, of course, until recently was very much in favor with US imperialism. It was one of their not quite trusted allies, but sort of was quite sort of in the in club. Could you perhaps say if we actually have to take sides in Syria at the moment, and how that change has come about? If you know it, I know it's a complicated situation, but I'm sure it's not just, I mean, there's a number of groups there involved, isn't it, in Syria? I'm sure it's not just sort of US puppets directly. Thanks.
Okay, Yasmin, before you come in on that one, I'd like to take Ben and then Jack, and then perhaps you can come in and respond to that. Thank you.
Can I be heard now? I can.
Yes, you can.
Righty-ho. A tiny point, but it's many years since I've heard commentators on Syria refer to the regime no longer as a Ba'ath regime, but simply as a one-man dictatorship, first of all by Hafiz al-Assad, and then under Bashar al-Assad. Is the Syrian Ba'ath actually a real political party? Is it the party that governs? Is it more a FSB type secret police regime? The notion Bonapartism floats vaguely in mind. I'm keen to be enlightened on this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Jack?
Yeah, thanks, Yasmin. I'm not going to attempt to answer Ben's questions. I'm going to rely on Yasmin. I don't know if Yasmin can answer either. All I would say is that the idea of supporting Assad now is super dumb. It's X. He's I don't know where he is. I was just reading the Daily Telegraph and reports of him either going to Moscow or Abu Dhabi, or the plane disappearing from the radar. Whatever it is, it's an X regime. What happens to the Ba'ath Party? I would have thought, Yasmin, again, you might know more than I do. I would have thought there'll be quite a few that will be crossing from Syria into Lebanon. I mean, if I was a member of the Ba'ath Party, and I don't know how far down that would go, but I would be very tempted to, scuttle off to Lebanon and just wait and see. But again, that's just my comment on that. Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to come in on the left that has viewed Assad as some sort of asset, an anti-imperialist asset, some sort of what do you want to call it, enemy of the United States or something like that. I mean, my own take on it is that just because you're against the United States doesn't make you anti-imperialist. And I think that sort of attitude discredits the left. It's an example of lack of working class independent politics. It's the sort of politics that whoever is against the United States, we are for. But precisely the problem in the Middle East, and I think you can see this with the tragedy of the Kurds, is that you get a constant churning, a constant alteration of who's on side and who's offside. And so, to me, the idea that this was a US operation, I find hard to credit. I could be wrong. It does strike me, and I don't know what Yasmin thinks. We've got an article coming in the Weekly Worker this week from Comrade Essen. I mean, to me, it smacks at least in terms of giving the green light as a Turkish operation. And just to finish, really, the rapidity of the collapse has sort of surprised me. I went to bed late last night finishing an article on Christmas, believe it or not. And so I had my notes for my political report later, and I stopped watching the news, and I woke up this morning and didn't listen to the news, gave a political report, and comrades informed me. I said, this really reminds me of Afghanistan. It looks like the regime will fall, I said. And comrade said, it already has. So I think that illustrates it. And again, just to make the point, I was editing Yasmin's article on Wednesday night, and I put in, Aleppo has fallen. No, Yasmin, you had most of Aleppo has fallen, and I edited in. Now it's Homs, and wow, here we are, and it's Damascus that has fallen. But I do think, Yasmin, not only did you have the signs of the change in terms of the Iranian press, you also had Assad doubling the pay or increasing the pay of soldiers, and them abandoning cities. To me, that was just, they're not going to fight. And so the soldiers, to all intents and purposes, has gone on strike. And it was a matter of time. But I don't think myself that this was a US operation. My reading is that this was Turkey, and maybe not to go to Damascus, but simply to expand its regional base. And they make their move, and just like dominoes, the troops fall, and they go, Jesus, I didn't say Jesus, but God bless Allah sort of type idea. We can take Damascus. Precisely whether then they can hold the country, that's an entirely different question. I mean, YPG, the Americans, who knows what other groups, other actors are there.
Thank you, Jack. So Yasmin, before I bring you in, there's a post in the chat, which it kind of chimes with Jack's later comments around the Taliban and Afghanistan. Somebody's drawn parallels there, and their question is, what does this promise for women? So I'll hand back over to you to answer some of those questions.
There is Mike as well on the list, no?
I'll bring Mike in after you've responded.
Okay. Okay. I don't think you can support Assad. I mean, I never supported Assad, even although I wrote against all the opposition to Assad in 2011 to 2016. And although I don't think this notion of sections of the British left is that this was a genuine Arab Spring movement, I never supported Assad, not just because of his association with Iran. He is a weak character in an out-of-date ideology, Arab nationalism, who came to power. And in fact, because he was a weak character, he became a very serious and brutal dictator. His dictatorship is not in doubt. The fact that he dealt with opposition very brutally is not in doubt. The reason I questioned the whole Arab Spring scenario is that, yes, there were inevitably dissidents in Syria opposing Assad at the time, and they continued to oppose Assad. It was a bit strange in that I was in Egypt in the height of Tahrir Square, where tens of thousands were on Tahrir Square. And I was watching various TV channels just to see how they were reporting Tahrir Square. Both Al Arabiya, paid by Saudi Arabia, another channel paid by United Arab Emirates, and the US media, CNN, were concentrating not on Tahrir Square, but a dozen people protesting against Assad in Damascus. So my own view of the Arab Spring in Damascus was very much tainted by this deliberate attempt to use a genuine opposition to Assad as part of something that had far bigger, far wider implications in the region. But Assad's relations with that movement was terrible. And what we can read is that throughout the last 20 years, the last 13 years, 14 years, he's just done worse and worse. And even his allies were telling him, you should negotiate, you should find a long-term solution for Idlib. He would refuse. And this shows this weak character becoming a terrible dictator. the question of supporting Assad is now theoretical. He's left. I mean, you can't support, and as far as I can see, no one in their right mind is going to defend Assad, because they would be, the mood in Damascus, from what I can see, is one of celebration, and rightly so, because a dictator has left. But there's also chaos, and in that chaos, all sorts of things can happen. This idea is that Assad was a very serious, important part of the axis of resistance is also nonsense. Of course, he wasn't, and he wasn't even in a position to be a strong member of the axis of resistance. And this whole concept of Iran and its proxies is often exaggerated for the purposes of US and Israeli publicity. I've said enough about it without going into detail. In terms of the Ba'ath Party, it existed until, if you look it up, it existed until the 8th of December 2024. The fact that it had become, if you like, paper organizations that just supported Assad is a different matter, but you could say the same of the Ba'ath Party in the latter days of Saddam Hussein. For example, when Assad appointed ministers, he would make the point that this particular minister is not part of the Ba'ath Party, as if that's kind of opening up type of situation. It's true that, as far as I can see, its last Congress wasn't held after 2011, so 2010 is the last reported Congress. But it had members, and it has members, and those members presumably are very keen to hide their identity or leave the country, unless this membership has become, as some people have said, a membership that is just by working for the government, you have to become a member of the Ba'ath Party. In terms of Golan Heights, I should make it clear that what I was talking about this was the Syrian part, close to the Golan Heights. And in that, Iran seems to have actually raised the issue long before the current events. I looked up earlier reports, and some of the Iranian press were saying, we've spent so much money, we've spent so much effort defunding Assad, why isn't he supporting us? In terms of, will it bring the same, Taliban is in power as a large organization with powerful base in Afghanistan. I can't see this Syrian group holding power for long in Damascus or anywhere, unless all of the other opposition have died down. My guess is there will be civil wars, there will be infighting between the various groups, and we don't know who will come to power. So predicting that the plight of women in Afghanistan will be repeated in Syria is premature at this stage. I don't think that is what we should be really too worried about. What is more a scenario that can happen is continued war in that area, continued bombardment by Israel, maybe more direct intervention, this time by the US, to keep peace, to be the civilized force that stops the warring factions or whatever. And again, not in terms of military army intervention, but in terms of bombing that they have done on a number of occasions. I think it's correct to say that Turkey has backed this group, but as I've written before, and there are now numerous examples to prove it, the group also relied on a level of support from Israel, HTS. A level of support from Israel, especially when it came to injured fighters. There are numerous reports in the Middle East press about how the injured fighters from this group were treated in Israeli hospitals. My understanding is that Turkey gave the green light for the initial attack on Aleppo, but did not expect it to go this far. And in all the reports that I have seen, in the last conversations because Turkey, Iran, and Russia were talking all of last week to decide what will happen. And in all of those talks, there doesn't seem to be a major difference between Iran, Turkey, and Russia, i.e., they all came to the conclusion there is no point saving Assad, let him go. Maybe Turkey was more adamant on this, but maybe it wasn't. I don't know, but I can assure you that Turkey wasn't simply the force that created this. It has benefits for Turkey, but it also has serious issues, because now the YPGA can become a serious force in Syria, and this will strengthen PKK, and the illusions created about Rojava and the Syrian Kurds will help the PKK, and therefore it's not as straightforward. I think I've covered most of these.
Yeah, thank you. Mike.
Yeah, just on the involvement of the United States, which it seems to me, the fact that we saw stuff about the white helmets resurfacing suggests that there's probably US, who were some sort of US Special Forces operation, suggests there's probably some US Special Forces involvement. I would probably also say it seems to me that what's happened in the last few months points in the direction of Joe Biden seeking to create a real legacy. And this real legacy is remaking the Middle East. Now, he's not remaking the Middle East through US boots on the ground or even through US bombs falling, but through letting the Israelis off the leash, not only in relation to Gaza, but also in relation to Lebanon. And at the same time, also upping the ante in the Ukraine war, which I would flag, although it's stalemate on the ground in the Black Sea, very serious defeats have been inflicted on the Russian Black Sea Fleet. And that is connected to the ability of the Russian state to give practical support to the Assad regime, which was as important. Okay, it was Iranian boots on the ground, but it was Russian airstrikes and so on and so forth, backing the Ba'athist regime in Syria. So it seems to me that Biden, it's interesting the different things people do in response to being lame duck. They may do okay, let the others take over, or they may say let's create let's do something. And of course Biden can't point to his quote Inflation Reduction Act, which was marketed as a quote Green New Deal as legacy, but he could say we've made a legacy that we've helped Israel obtain secure borders by expanding its reach, radically knocking out Syria. And then it might be the case that we're going to see actual strikes on Iran before Trump gets in. But certainly also upping the ante in Ukraine. That's a little bit like the Tories when it was obvious they were going to lose the election. Introduce a whole series of tax cuts in order to make life as difficult as possible for the Labour government, which was inevitably going to succeed them. And that it's not quite the same, because if Biden letting the Israelis off the leash really does remake the borders of the Middle East and create. We've got also reported Israelis being given basing rights in Somaliland, for the purpose of fighting the Houthis, which in effect makes Somaliland into a semi-colony of Israel. So that there's a sense in which you can really talk about Israel as being potentially becoming an actual sub-imperialist power as opposed to merely a US proxy. I agree with Jack, incidentally, though, in spite of saying I've just been talking about the United States, the reality, the idea that, and in a sense, Yasmin's article in the paper about BRICS the other week, is part of the point. The idea that the solution to US world dominance is counter-nationalism. Is in essence delusional. If we ask the question when the last time the US was actually defeated, as opposed to going in and leaving behind nothing but wreckage, which has been actually US policy since it was last defeated, and it was defeated in Vietnam. And what it was defeated by in Vietnam was an internationalist, a communist and internationalist movement, which, because it was a communist and internationalist movement and not merely nationalist, was able to reach deeply into the American working class and the American armed forces, and thereby, at the end of the day, the United States was not defeated on the battlefield. It was defeated in Vietnam because its army fell apart, and it was defeated in Vietnam because its army fell apart because of the powerful influence of the civil rights movement in the 1960s and the anti-Vietnam War movement starting in the middle 1960s and running into the early 1970s. And that I think is fundamental. That it is the case that the United States is when the United States does humanitarian intervention, it means the same sort of thing as the Romans' humanitarian intervention in Carthage to stop child sacrifice by massacring all the inhabitants and sowing the ground with salt, or the Romans' intervention in Britain to stop humanitarian intervention in Britain in 43 AD to stop human sacrifice by, again, large-scale massacres. They make a desert and they make a depopulation and call it peace. And the United States is like that, but at the same time, it's not that the United States isn't like that. It's not that the United States isn't a super-imperialism. The problem is that the only way of overcoming that is through internationalist and socialist/communist positive alternative to that regime. That's it.
Thank you very much, Mike. I'm conscious that we do have a second part of this forum, so I'm going to ask Yasmin to sum up.
You've missed Paul.
Oh, sorry, I didn't see Paul's hand go up. Sorry, Paul. But if I can ask you to keep it brief, Paul.
Yeah. I forgot what I was going to say now.
Sorry, I put you off, haven't I?
Okay. Yeah, it's the looking around on various left sites and comments made. There is an amazing amount of optimism on parts of the left. Someone mentioned here Michael Karagias, for instance, and he was berating me and other people for saying that the fall of Assad at the hands of jihadis is not going to be a victory for anyone except for the reactionary powers, including the USA and Israel. There's a I've brought it up here. Yeah, the fact that this jihadi leader has reinvented himself. I like the Zelensky comparison. The sort of trying to present himself in that way as some kind of cuddly liberal, and it's been taken up by the press in Britain. The fact is that the HTS is still very much a jihadi organization. There was a correspondent on the BBC News this morning saying that whilst the prisons run by the Ba'athist state have been opened and the prisoners released, the prisons run by the HTS in Aleppo and other places are still full of their enemies. And so I just think that anyone who thinks that anything positive is going to come out from the fall of Assad's regime in respect of any sort of democratic outcome is fooling himself. Another report on the BBC I noticed was that there were clashes between the jihadi forces and the Kurdish forces. Now, seeing that American policy has been to get rid of the Assad regime, and also the Kurds have become inveigled into the American plans for the Middle East, it seems as though they've got basically two American almost proxies at war with each other, which doesn't augur well for stability in the area. And also the question of, I think it was Jack mentioned it, that the Israeli government has been fairly okay about jihadis running amok in the Middle East, as they don't seem to ever attack any Israeli interests. This also, I think, has a not only an impact upon the Shia forces, such as Hezbollah and others, but also on the question of what's happening in Palestine, because if the so-called axis of resistance is out of the running in Lebanon, Syria, and that means that Israel has got even more of an open hand to deal with Palestine in the brutal way that it's been doing. So I just think that this has really kicked things on in the Middle East, events in the Middle East. The other thing is the question of Russia's ability to get to the Mediterranean, because it did have a seaport that it had under Ba'athist control on the Mediterranean. Now must surely be gone now. I'll have to ask Yasmin, does this also affect the question of Iran? Did Iran use the Mediterranean at all? Anyway, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Paul. Okay, Yasmin, if you'd like to come back on the last.
I'll try and be.
Then just before you do, there's also somebody's raised the question of Rojava.
I saw that.
Yes. Yeah.
I saw that. Yeah, I'll cover that. Okay, so let's start with the Kurds and PKK. I think it would be wrong, despite the humanitarian air drops for Rojava, to put them in the same position as the jihadists that United Arab Emirates and other allies of the US support in the region. From what I can read and see, Rojava and the PKK, for all their many mistakes and problems, have been very strong on supporting Palestine. They have gone out of their way to express solidarity, to express political opinion. I'm no fan of PKK, but in this respect, both Rojava and PKK have been very clear. So I don't think we could put them in the same basket as jihadists who have failed to throw a single shot at Israel and have verbally, as I reported earlier, said to Israel, there's nothing wrong with friendship with Israel, which is their current position, or at least some of their groups puts that position. And inevitably, there will be fightings between not just the Kurds in Syria and the jihadists, but amongst the various jihadists who claim some who are close to ISIS and therefore closer to the history of Al-Qaeda, close to the border with Iraq, and still have bases, and this group that split from Al-Qaeda. So I can't see this group being able to consolidate power unless some major government, and here I'm not talking of Turkey, I'm talking of US or Israel, backing them fully in terms of making them the power of the Syrian territory. And here, I think it's also important to talk about the US. The white helmets are very interesting. The BBC covered a story only earlier this year in 2024, explaining to us its dubious connections to MI6 and various secret services. And yet, these days, they are reporting about as a humanitarian independent organization quoted by the same organization's news reporters and analysts. So I think keep an eye on the white helmets, wherever they are. It's not independence, peace, or solidarity with the people of Syria that they are bringing. But I do think that rather than Joe Biden, just Joe Biden wanting to remake the Middle East, we already have a plan, an Israeli plan for remaking the Middle East. And in this plan, both Joe Biden and the Republicans, I'm not sure about Trump because we never know what he's done, but on this plan, the Republicans and the Democrats in the US are united. And this plan does include dividing Iran into regions and destroying a country, Iran. I keep saying this, and our wonderful Iranian leftists who have now become pro-Israeli or soft on Zionism say, oh no, there is no plan by Israel. Of course there is. Anyone who closes their eyes is either stupid or paid by Israel. I'm sorry, you fall into either of the two categories. And I think here, the question of strikes on Iran are very much on the table. Whether it will happen before 20th of January or after 20th of January is the question we have to consider. But clearly the assessment by the army, by the military, is that Iran is weak. Its ballistic forces have been severely reduced. And the long-term solution for all of these people has been two very clear aims: ethnic cleansing of Palestine and the destruction of the state of Iran. And the state of Iran is not just the government of the Islamic Republic. For the United States, the Republicans, and large sections of the Democrats, it's the Iranian people who dared get rid of the US's best servant in the Middle East, the Shah of Iran. So we can expect the continuation of this. We won't see the end of it. Syria is not the end. Syria was never the end. Syria was the step towards bombing Iran, and we are now closer to that step, in my opinion. I might be pessimistic, but that's what I think. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much for that presentation, Yasmin. Very useful. Okay, now for the second half of the forum this evening. So I'd like to hand over to Jack.
Thanks, Andy. I'm going to try to keep from overrunning time-wise, so I'll be succinct. I'm going to start off with Alistair Carnes, and you asked the question, who's he? Well, other than the guy that's come out and said the British Army, won't last 6 months in a serious war, his official title is Minister for Veterans. But the significance here, of course, is that the Labour government is preparing a defence review, and what you've got is not only the Minister of Veterans basically agitating for more money for the army, more money for the Air Force, more money for the Navy. What you've got is the heads of the armed forces themselves. And basically, what they're calling for is the pledge by Labour to increase so-called defence spending to 2.5% of gross national product. Basically, what they're calling for is that to be realised early or earlier, as opposed to the end of the 4 or 5 year term of the Labour government. And what this particular minister is calling for, and others in the armed forces themselves, isn't so much an expansion of the full-time army, it's the reserve force. So there's, roughly speaking, 100,000 full-time soldiers in the British Army, 20,000 reservists. We're not talking about the territorial army, but 20,000 reservists, and basically the agitation is to expand that. Now, the reality is that his figures, I mean, as soon as I read the story, I thought, yeah, sure, this will be a load of rubbish, and it was. His story, his sort of claim is, look, if you look at Russia fighting in Ukraine, it's losing something like 1,000, maybe 1,500 a day in terms of casualties. That's deaths, but most of them will be injuries. And if you add the 100,000 into that, yes, the British Army would be very quickly eliminated. But the reality is that what we're talking about isn't a Russian invasion of Britain. We're not talking about Russia versus Britain. We're talking about Britain as part of NATO, presumably fighting in Eastern Europe. And exactly, if that happened, it wouldn't be Russia against Ukraine. It would be Russia against NATO. And you would end with a completely different set of figures, completely different form of warfare. In other words, this is a typical piece of political but also military agitation. And what I wanted to do is just make 2 points here. And one is against the forces on the so-called left, who we characterize, I think quite rightly, as social imperialists, the arm Ukraine pseudo left, people like the Alliance for Workers' Liberty, anti-capitalist resistance, people who used to be on the left like Paul Mason, who've gone over completely to the side of imperialism. These people precisely, if we take the old phrase, what they're advocating, what they should advocate, what they should be open and honest about, is what they should be advocating is arms, is guns, not butter. And of course, if you read their press at the moment, in terms of Rachel Reeves and her budget, cutting of winter fuel payments to pensioners, there's much wringing of hands on this question. The reality is that if you're going to arm Ukraine, what you need is a war industry. You need to be able to produce tanks, not just for Ukraine, but in general. If you're going to supply Ukraine with what it needs, it will be F-35s, for example. And therefore, you've got to make F-35s. If you're going to supply them with missiles, such as Storm Shadow, note that there's only been one battery released so far. That's true with ATACMS as well. You need an industry that's constantly producing them. And therefore, precisely, not just 2% of gross national product, but 2.5% and beyond. That's what they ought to be honest about, and of course aren't honest about. The other point I just wanted to make in respect of this is, of course, that now that we've had the Trump victory and we've got the appointment of Keith Kellogg as Trump's Ukraine envoy, what you've seen is the shift in Zelensky's rhetoric. from every Russian soldier's got to go, the return of every inch of Ukrainian territory back to 2014. All of that's changed. And what you've got now is Zelensky talking about the quickest possible peace. So complete about turn. Amazingly, that's been described in some sections of the media as a brilliant example of Zelensky's politics. It's not. It's simply a recognition that Trump is now president-elect, and you know, within in just over a month, will be back in the White House, and he will impose at least negotiations. I won't push it any further. So just to finish on Zelensky, there's an interesting article. If you can read it, I would recommend it. I can't remember who the author was, but it's in the New Statesman. And basically, this is a report which we don't normally read, of how unpopular now Zelensky is with the Ukrainian population. And basically, if there was a presidential election, I know that's a big if, but he would lose big time. And so we have this impression in Britain, we have this impression, I would guess, in the West, that he's hugely popular. He's certainly popular in the Western media, but in Ukraine itself, people blame him for a war which is going to end in what? A loss of territory. Why have we been fighting? Why have we sacrificed so many tens of thousands of Ukrainian lives for a war that hasn't actually regained our territory? Why didn't we come to a peace deal with Russia earlier? And therefore, there's all sorts of talk of this minister or this head of the Secret Service winning. Who the hell knows? But yeah, I just thought that was worth mentioning, because of course, as we've had with the report on Syria, merely because you have peace in Ukraine, which isn't necessarily guaranteed by a long chalk, the reality is that the United States is determined to reverse its relative decline. And what that does is point us towards the real enemy of the United States in terms of its perception, and that's, of course, China. Anyway, moving on, just a very quick comment on France. No surprise this time, the fall of the Barnier prime ministership, his government. I think it was only a matter of time, simply because the arithmetic in the National Assembly doesn't add up. What was interesting about it isn't so much that the resolution from the New Popular Front won. It was the fact that Le Pen, Marine Le Pen, backed it and therefore pulled the rug from under Barnier. And that's been judged as the National Rally moving into a position of where it's shaping politics in France. You know, at the moment we have Macron saying he's going to stay on until 2027. That's when his second term finishes. You know, as an outsider, I'm almost, well, I know that he would have tried to split the New Popular Front. He would have courted the Socialist Party, the Greens, perhaps. Crucially, though, the Socialist Party. That doesn't seem to have worked so far. There's also the possibility, and again, that was talked about at the time of the Assembly elections, of doing a deal with National Rally. And I don't think that we should discount that as a possibility. If you remember the elections, there were talks going on before them, because National Rally was expected to emerge as the biggest party in terms of the election campaign until the New Popular Front got its act together. But there were negotiations going on between National Rally and the French equivalent of the CBI, the Confederation of British Industry, So I'm going to make up a name for them, the Confederation of French Industry. So I don't think we should discount that possibility. If that happens, one thing that you can guarantee, I think, is that the legal threat against Marine Le Pen, the prosecution, I'd call it lawfare against Marine Le Pen because of corruption in Brussels, in terms of her being an MEP and her fraction in the Europe, that will be dropped. I view that as a political move. I'm not saying that they're innocent, but clearly this is politically motivated because amongst the threats to her was to actually bar her from public office for 5 years. We don't know what's going to happen in France. That's certainly the case. But all I would say is that they're the two possibilities, at least I can see, in the short term, as opposed to 2027, when, of course, Macron cannot stand for a third term in sequence. And we have the possibility, I think, of perhaps a national rally minority government supported by the so-called centre-right, and perhaps followed by a Marine Le Pen presidency in 2027. Does that mean that civilization is about to collapse? Does that mean that we're on the threshold of something, equivalent to 1933? I think this is misreading history. I think it's misreading what National Rally is. I think it's misreading what the Brotherhood Party, the Brotherhood of Italy Party, Meloni is in Italy. I think these organizations are post-fascist. I don't think Trump is a fascist. I think things will get very nasty, but I don't see us, being on the threshold of something the equivalent of 1933. In other words, I am personally not. I don't like the. This is the 1930s in slow motion. To me, this is where we're at the moment. It resembles much more, the sleepwalk into World War I, minus the existence of the working class being a world force in its own right. That is absent at the present time, and that's our task. Okay, I was going to better say now to Syria in terms of my notes. No, we're skipping that one. I just wanted to raise, because we had a discussion 2 weeks ago, I just wanted to put my oar in, and also precisely to allow comrades to revisit that discussion, the assisted dying bill moved by Leadbeater, which got a 55 majority in the House of Commons, which is quite narrow. I think that's a direct reversal of what it was 10 years ago. In my view, what we are talking about at the present time is the principle involved. My expectation, my fear is that given that we're going to the committee stage, is that what we'll be talking about is a situation that potentially is worse in terms of doctors and dying patients is concerned if that legislation, if that bill becomes an act. Why do I think that? I think that because I think there will be all sorts of safeguards put in that will mean that doctors will be intimidated when it comes to administering that opium to patients. I can't do it because I'm threatened with 14-year prison sentence, sort of type idea. And in that sense, I'm not saying it's a direct analogy, but I am saying that there's some lesson there from 1967, not with the abortion Act, which, of course, if you're a Christian fundamentalist, you could view as well, that's a slippery slope that's led to the assisting dying bill or the assisted suicide bill, call it whatever you want. But I'm thinking specifically in terms of police action and intimidation with the legalization of homosexuality in 1967. The paradox was that having made it legal, you had all sorts of safeguards. And amongst the safeguards was that homosexual acts had to be between consenting adults in private. And what you had is an awful lot of policemen being given instructions to tour toilets and places like Hampstead Heath, and I would guess, Clapham Common. What do they call them? I can't remember what they're called. Cruising, and arresting and prosecuting. So the number of prosecutions for homosexual acts leapt up after the 67 Act. But what I would argue myself is that while you would vote for the principle of assisted dying, you then shouldn't view that everything is now okay. It's not. What is needed is continual struggle, both to protect people who are vulnerable, but also to establish the right of autonomous individuals to decide their own future. At the moment, I have no problem. If I wanted to end my life, I can do it tonight. But if I was terminally ill and I couldn't use my hands, I was paralyzed, I don't have that ability to determine my fate. Anyway, I'm introducing that simply to encourage comrades to join the discussion. I say join the discussion. We've been promised letters in the Weekly Worker. They haven't actually materialized. But we did have the article by Paul DeMarti, which I thought was a very good article. But personally, I profoundly disagreed with it. We don't have a CPGB line. And I'm not saying that on the basis of, a lot of mainstream commentary around the assisted dying bill. Isn't it good to have Parliament so mature that they have this wonderful discussion, and every party, every faction seemed to split? So you had a split in Reform UK, you had a split in the Socialist Campaign Group, so John McDonnell on one side, Diane Abbott, you had a split in the Tories, you had a split in Labour, blah, blah, blah. No, I'm not saying that. If it came to a parliamentary debate, my own view would be that our, parliamentarians would be instructed how to vote. Anyway, that's the sort of penultimate. No, two more, excuse me. So let's see what we are with time, 1:15. Okay. Just a very quick comment on Reform UK. There's been a number of polls in Britain, some of which put Reform UK ahead of the Labour Party. So in terms of Keir Starmer's party, no surprise, as soon as it gets into government, its popularity falls. We've seen the boring relaunch, so-called, or reset. I just thought myself, this is just so, how should I put it, tiresome. I didn't bother to take much notice of it. Either way, of course, it hasn't lifted Labour's fortunes. Okay, so some polls put Reform UK above the Labour Party. The one that I've just looked at in the Independent, the poll of polls, has Labour Party on 27%, Reform on 21%, and the Tories on 25%. That's the Labour Party down 1%, Reform up 3%, the Tories down 3%. Liberal Democrats are sort of bumping along way out of sight. But my point would be here that it is interesting how much the right-wing press are actually promoting Reform UK. And indeed, my own feeling is that the more that the Labour Party goes on about we will solve mass migration, and of course it won't, it will not be able to do it. Just like Rishi Sunak with I will stop the small boats. No, Rishi, you will not be able to stop. The more it feeds in to reform. So it is a danger. And of course, early next year, we will have Nigel's best friend, Donald Trump, in the White House. And we'll also potentially, I don't know whether it will come to realization, the possibility at least of Elon Musk becoming a British as well as an American citizen. I don't know whether he's still a South African citizen. It wouldn't surprise me if he still was. But, you know, he's got enough family connection and he can buy his way to it. But remember the story, although it's been denied, but the talk of 100 million donation to reform UK. I listened to the interview on the BBC with Nigel Farage, and he sort of spluttered somewhat and said, we really don't need 100 million. I know it's small fry in American politics, but what we're talking about in normal terms in British politics is 10 million, 20 million in a general election time. So what the hell they would do with 100 million, I don't know. The danger actually is that the government would come in and simply legislate, outlawing such sizable donations. Either way, the point is there that Reform UK does represent a right-wing threat, a viable right-wing threat. And what we have is its transformation into a more regular party. And Nigel Farage is not only boasting about 100,000 members, and I presume that will be climbing, there's also a whole string of defections that have already happened and are expected to happen. So, for example, I can't remember his name, you all know, comrades, the main writer on Conservative Home, for example, has just defected from the Tories to Reform UK. And there's talk of various MPs following him into Reform UK. Okay, and I just wanted to finish with, I took really no notice of it, I must admit, at the time. But I've, again, I haven't gone up and read, but I've sort of gone, oh, that's worthwhile looking at. The story about Brian Thompson, the chief executive officer of United Healthcare, being killed in New York. Initially, I just went, well, someone's got a grudge against this insurance company. I understand it. What, of course, is the big story isn't so much the killing of this individual, which I suppose isn't an everyday occurrence, but it's the response to it that is the significance. And again, I don't know where things stand at the moment, but the last time I looked it up, which was earlier today, one would expect it to grow. I came across one particular site where there were 76,000 people that had gone, oh, Brian's been assassinated. Isn't that a shame? No, they weren't. They were saying, Brian Thompson's been assassinated. Good. They're going, whoopee. Now, what I wanted to say on this is really related to, I should put it, the sad is Moscow. Okay, I'm not going to read Mike's post on that. What I wanted to bring up here is the danger that sections of the left, in the broadest way we characterize the left, can actually view this as an example to follow. So it's not just something to applaud, but something to emulate. And I've raised this because I see that as a danger, given where we're at politically, with the working class being weak, or where the working class is, organized into bureaucratized trade unions, but also around the climate issue. For example, there we've just had COP, and everyone goes, well, it didn't decide anything, and what it decided it isn't going to deliver. And there we've got Donald Trump coming into the White House and will pull the world's second largest polluter, the world's biggest historical polluter. He's going to pull it out of the Paris Accord. So what's the use of COP, talking shop? What's the use of Joe Biden's useless so-called Green New Deal? No, what we want is, to quote a particular left-winger, is we want the capitalists to fear. And therefore, maybe we should follow, who knows who it is that's taken out Brian Thompson, but maybe we should follow that example. And certainly if you look at discussion around the climate issue, you've had, I think, significantly the Maun book turned into a Hollywood film, How to Blow Up a Pipeline. You've had the shift from Extinction Rebellion having mass protests in London, like in Oxford Circus, over to Just Say No to Oil, and people sitting down in the road, to attacks, in the National Gallery, and against paintings, attacks in Madame Tussauds against waxwork images of the monarch and the heir apparent. Well, why not go one stage further? Why not go from taking out a pipeline, sitting down in the road, custard pieing, baked beaning a Van Gogh? Why not go and take out take out oil executives? Why stop at insurance executives? To me, that's a danger. And the danger is that precisely when I read The Socialist Worker and some sections of the left, they almost want to encourage elitist actions. And I think what we should be emphasizing is mass action. But when it comes to the climate question, for example, as it does with, I think, actually the health question, we do need to go from the politics of protest, where the left is stuck at the moment in the imagination that if only we have one more demonstration, if only we have one more political strike, the system will collapse. No, we need to go from the politics of protest to the politics of power. And to go to the politics of power, that's a huge thing, because what we need is a party, the sort of party that Mike McNair is arguing for in this edition of the Weekly Worker, and will be arguing in the next part of his article, for a mass communist party, not a broad front, not an alliance, not a we don't polemicize, keep quiet in case you offend the Labour bureaucracy sort of party, but a communist party with the sort of robust, healthy internal life that we saw in the German social democracy in the 19th century, early 20th century, but we also saw in the Bolshevik party up to the point of the Civil War and the militarization of that party, which has unfortunately been copied by so many of the sects in the 20th century. So we want genuine democratic centralism, not bureaucratic centralism. We want a democratic centralist mass communist party that's based firmly on a principled program, and that keeps its parliamentary representatives and its councillors and its trade union leaders, on a tight rein, because we've got a robust culture of open debate and open criticism. So thank you, Andy. I hope there's still enough time. There is So there's still plenty of time for discussion.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Jack. Before I open it up to the floor, I'm going to abuse the position of the chair. In terms of Brian Thompson, I think it's quite interesting that